Welcome to the Building Home track. This is the talk, Staring into the Abyss, the Dark Side of Security and Professional Intelligence. Our speaker has been around for a good long time. He keynoted the very first Black Hat, and this will be his 16th year at DEF CON. He is a noted author and professional speaker, the author of Mind Games, a book of fiction, which was published last year. A friend at NSA told him that he couldn't talk about the job unless he wrote a work of fiction, so that's what he did, and Mind Games is the result. He speaks all over the world, including Hack in the Box in Amsterdam, Ecom, Security Summit in Johannesburg, and Troopers in Heidelberg. Mr. Richard Thieme.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. All right, got the laugh. Take the mask off. That's what it's good for. HB Gary wouldn't let us take a picture near the booth, but you can't blame him, can you? As somebody said, it's like putting a biker suck bumper sticker on your car at a Harley rally. You know, you just don't do that. Hi, and thank you for showing up, and we can make this interactive after a while. I'm going to try to build a bigger picture of the security world than we are usually in the habit of hearing described in the, in all the conferences that we go to and all the talks that we listen to. I'm going to try to look at some of the nested realities in which security is really taking place and ask ourselves whether the word security itself is appropriate to what is in fact the behaviors that actually take place in the quote security space, unquote. It's true I've been around for a long time. DEF CON 4 was the first DEF CON at which I spoke, and somebody in the London Telegraph said that I was a father figure for online culture. About a decade later, one of the hackers said, actually, that should be changed to grandfather figure for online culture. And last year, during my talk at DEF CON, somebody tweeted, "You may think Richard Thieme is just a deranged old man wandering around the con, but he's actually saying something useful." So for those of you who are still young and find that fanciful and Hollywoodish, those are the dots that will connect in your life too. And so be compassionate on silverbacks. Who have, after all, compensations for the decline of testosterone. When it started, I thought I was finally gaining some self-control at last. It's just chemicals. So, but what chemicals take away, chemicals can give back. Okay. But enough about me. Another sign of how things have changed really is Jeff Moss. I mean, you saw Jeff and Mudge. You know, I reminded Mudge not long ago, I said, do you remember my first talk at DEF CON was called Hacking as Practice for Life in the 21st Century? Because you guys, I said, are going to be the thought leaders that shape the social and economic and political structures in which people unknowingly and unconsciously live, and therefore what you're really building is a world, not just hacking. And Mudge said, yes, some of us thought you were crazy, but some of us knew exactly what you were talking about. Around that time, Jeff Moss said to me, you know, if you're 20 years old and you're working for the man, you're a loser. Actually, lamer, he said. And about 10 years later, when all the big companies were swarming the conferences and the attendance had increased and business meetings were taking place everywhere and recruitment was going on and the dot-com boom hadn't busted, Jeff said, you know, if you're 30 and you're not working for the man, you're a loser. And last year, I could say to Jeff, after he got on the DHS advisory board and now ICANN, no they can't, and all those other signs of respectability, and sold Black Hat itself, I said, now at 40, you are the man. And that's another way to connect the dots, more hopefully than deranged old man wandering around the con. Okay, so as we grow, as we do grow and go through developmental changes, hopefully our view of things gets more sophisticated, more nuanced, more complex, and that usually means a greater sense of the grayness of all things, the grayness of all things. You hear here often about black hat hackers and gray hat hackers and white hat hackers, and they're often defined, I think, imprecisely. A black hat hacker is a hacker. A gray hat hacker is a hacker who knows when to fudge the truth. And a white hat hacker is a hacker who put the truth down somewhere and can't remember where he put it. So it's all gray. It's all gray. The world is gray. Distinctions that seem clear and precise in our earlier life all go liquid on us, and we realize that everything is not as binary as the code, which is hackable. So I want to do justice to the fact that we live in this grayness, and talk about what's real and why security, in effect, sucks. After I did a talk in Heidelberg for troopers, guy from Cisco, he said, "You've illuminated everything. All I have to do is tell people the truth. My job sucks. I can't do it. We're insecure. We can't provide security." So this talk is not about 3 things to run home and do on Monday morning or Sunday night or whatever. It's designed to illuminate this fuzzy landscape of our professional and personal lives. And in a well-integrated human being, they're the same, of course, so that subsequently, not Monday morning, but later, you're going to come to some crossroads that are critical, both in terms of what you're doing and how you do it. What challenges are presented to you as a person, and what sometimes even ethical issues will result as a result of your struggling to maintain some semblance of integrity in a world which invites you to surrender that right up front and stop telling the truth about things. When you are at those crossroads, it is my hope that you will remember some of the things we're going to talk about this morning, and that they will illuminate possibilities. All right? This is a quote from a good friend. In 2010, Frost and Sullivan estimated there were 2.28 million information security professionals in the world, to which my friend said, "Then it sounds a lot better to make air quotes when you say information security professional." The truth is fudged all the time. We're all in it together. The world is gray. Hacking is a subset of the world. Therefore, hacking is gray. And what we encounter when we come to conferences like these is a narrative. Now, a narrative is a self-referential way of framing what we do that makes it easy to live with ourselves. So we are security professionals. Our narrative in our social world, and this is a social world, even though it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and so much money flows into it, the effect of the money is to sustain the paradigm which generated the money in the first place in order for us to continue to profit from it. And we have what we call externalities in the world of economics. Externalities are those things which do not have consequences right away for us. The consequences cascade into someone else's life down the line. So if you're a mortgage broker and you know what you're doing, but you're making money now, even if you know it's going to fall apart later, and you know the falling apart later is going to be on the shoulders of someone else, you very well may, in fact did, continue to do it. So when you're inside the narrative, you're in the picture. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about the frame or the ground of the picture, which we don't see. The context. I like to say that in a lot of my talks, I try to define the context in a way that turns it into content, because then it becomes a cognitive artifact. And once the context, which is changing so radically as a result of the impacts of technology on all of us, once that becomes a cognitive artifact, it can be manipulated. And in fact, you might say that what hacking is drilling deeper and deeper into the context of the system itself in order to manipulate it so that results show up here that look, as Arthur C. Clarke said, of technology that is incomprehensible to us, to a clueless user like magic. But at the same time, our social world has altered. A long time ago, I said what we were becoming was real birds in digital cages. I said that, well, when I start writing in the early 90s about these things, then I start publishing in other parts of the world because the internet enabled that to happen. And I received an email from a big public relations firm that was global, and they assumed I was in London because the article had been published in London, and people hadn't yet internalized that you can live anywhere and work everywhere, and do. And therefore, it didn't mean you were right there where they bought the magazine. The magazine, for those of you who are all kindled. A magazine is, we don't have any examples, but it looks kind of like, could you hold up your program? It looks like that. And when I was a kid, we used to have them stacked up. It was a waste of time and paper and everything. But he bought the magazine.net in London and thought I worked there. And he said, come over. We think you could do some good for us. And I said, what do you want? Although I can't come over, I'm in Milwaukee. And he said, oh, big culture shock, right? He said, well, what we want is someone to do brand defense. And I said, what is brand defense? And he said, brand defense is simple. Say that we have a client who's a tobacco company. And I said, oh, you want me to make like a website, which is a new thing then, a website on the World Wide Web, which defends your client. And he said, no. We want you to make 3 or 4 or 5 websites which attack our client, each from a different credible point of view. And we'll give you enough ammunition to make the attacks credible, but never enough to make a smoking gun show up, so that the people who are against tobacco will all go into your websites, and then we can inflect the conversation and move them where we will. We also want you to develop multiple NIMs. We didn't have the words then, but he said there are these things called Usenet groups where people chat online. And what we want you to do is have a whole bunch of names, and if in the tobacco Usenet groups people get too close to something that's dangerous, your job will be to blow it up or kill the cat or inflect the conversation. And what that made perfectly clear to me was that the acts of deception, which have been part of human and even chimpanzee life for many years, higher primates deceive as well, we're porting in a new sophisticated way into the virtual world. And that people, because of our intention to project belief, trust, and yes onto what we see as if it is real, would sit at the screen even without usability sophistication being implemented and believe that what they see is what is real. I talk about a hermeneutic of skepticism a lot, hermeneutic of suspicion, because of how much lies, half-truths, and the like are out there and are consciously manufactured. But the danger of that is that people lose the ability to think critically about these things and the tools with which they can think critically and get the information they need. So it shocks me that I still have people come up after talks sometimes and say, do you think we landed on the moon? Do you think we landed on the moon? And then I find out that 25% of Americans do not think we landed on the moon. In other words, there are a lot of morons in America, right? Yes, we landed on the moon. Millions of people did not cooperate with rudimentary telemetry and television technology in order to create a vast fiction for the sole purpose of having crowing rights over the Russians. And anyway, we're going back to the moon, and if we don't find the metal flag that we planted there, we'll know. But people don't have any idea what's true, and therefore they will believe the simplest explanation that secures their world. Their world is secure when they feel they can go to bed and wake up in the same world in which they went to sleep. That's bottom line. I'll return to that definition of security a lot. That is de facto what the intelligence community has become globally, a structure like a thermostat in the mind of society globally, designed to ameliorate the threat to burst out into bubbles of chaos, which a chaotic system is always threatening to do, but you never know through which bubble the foam will burst. And so our job as security professionals is to reassure people that they can pretty much count on the world to be pretty much what it looks like pretty much most of the time. And then you have to periodically inject plenty of fear into people's lives. Witness the recent budget talks. Oh, I don't know. Will we default? Will the world fall down? Will the financial system collapse? Oh, we don't know if we'll get it. Oh, we got a deal. Got a deal. So Marshall McLuhan said of the news long ago, the news is the bad stuff and the advertisements are the good stuff. And that's how it's set up. You feel more and more and more depressed watching what we used to call the news, and then you see an ad for something that lifts your heart. Buy this, buy that, go to this place, go to that place, and then you feel better about things. That's the essence of security work. Okay, so we're in cages, except it's changed. It's not just real birds in digital cages. Now, thanks to social networks, it's real flocks of birds in digital cages. And the difference is simply this, that not only are you in the cage, but because you see a bird there and a bird there and a bird there and a bird there, you have the illusion of security. You not only have the illusion of the freedom of flying by flapping your wings as if you are flying, while the cage slowly is turned as that executive at Hill and Knowlton Public Relations said when he wanted me to do brand defense. In other words, invent all sorts of structures that are deceptive in order to put people in them and then move the cage, and people will move with it. We can't help being assimilated to the social structures in which we are embedded. The Borg are us. There's just no way to avoid it. Margaret Mead, great anthropologist, said that it took her a whole year to learn again what she learned in the first week when she entered a new culture. And the reason was because when you first go in, you just see it all fresh. It's why we love to travel, right? It's why we want alien structures to confront us. We see it all different from how we shape and structure the world. But in only a week, you are so assimilated by the conversations you have. It's like when I did a lot of consulting, we used to say a consultant, their job is to be a cucumber and jump into the brine and cucumber the brine, but you always got pickled. And it was the same way. You start working with a company, pretty soon the one who's paying you to do the work owns you. Pretty soon you are part of them. Pretty soon the problems that you are hired to fix or solve, it's better to stretch them out a little bit. Pretty soon it's better to keep working on the problems together as long as the money is there. I remember after 9/11 going to a Homeland Defense conference right after it in Washington, and it was like people had bushel baskets running around looking for the spigots because we saw where the money was going to come. It was just going to pour on down. So the question, who profits, is always a good one to ask. And in an organizational culture of any kind, including the security space, if I may say that this is like the intelligence community, it's not a community, they kill one another. But the security space, this is a social space to which you rapidly become assimilated and learn what you can say and what you cannot say. In other words, just like joining a business, you learn the known but unwritten rules. You know, there are 4 kinds of rules, right? There's known and written. And that's when you join a company and they give you a big binder full of stuff. They're known while you leaf through it. And then you put that on a shelf and never look at it again. So they become written and unknown. But it doesn't matter because no one goes by those rules anyway. The rules that matter most are known and unwritten, and those are the unwritten cultural and social rules which you had better learn real quickly as you observe what behaviors are rewarded and which are punished in the company around you. So that you can have longevity there. It's the most important thing, really, in a way other than perform, that you can do when you join a company, is figure out how it really is here, what is tolerated and what is not. And then there's a 4th category, unknown and unwritten. Those are deep structural rules that govern our unconsciousness, which is most of us, but we don't have to concern ourselves with that. So learning the known but unwritten rules in the security space is one of the important things in becoming a security professional, as well as becoming a vendor. And so when we talk about the problems that confront security, the weakest link in the chain, as Matt Blaze said, is frequently the definition of the problem. And the definition of the problem is really not what we think it is. So, who are we really? What is the security space? My iPad, which is keeping time here, keeps going off. I have to keep unlocking it. Okay. What is this self-referential narrative about the industry, and what does it exclude? What is the rule base of the filter, and how well does it work at the perimeter? And just as in the computing space, is there a perimeter anymore? In other words, where have we put the truth as we became white hats and forgotten how to pick it up? What really is it? Nothing is harder to see than the things we believe so deeply that we don't remember that we believe them. We stop believing that we believe them, we just believe them. And the worst thing you can do with beliefs are good, beliefs are useful, beliefs are helpful, especially in sales talks and marketing. Just don't believe in your beliefs, because our narratives are self-referential, bounded by mutual self-interest, and characterized by a heavy, heavy dose of groupthink. So what we want to talk about is reality. Reality, Philip K. Dick said, is that which, when you stop believing in it, refuses to go away. And the way Timothy Leary put it, great old LSD guru, times past, there's always one. At Ecom in San Francisco, I referred to when the caterpillar asked Alice, who are you? Because we were talking about identity, and I said, that's the kind of truth that you only get when you're dropping acid. And yeah, just like that. You can tell. You know who recognizes the truth from the chuckle. Okay, so Timothy Leary said, you never get the truth from the company memo. And that was a way of saying that as you're integrated into the institutional culture, as you go up, you come to instantiate or articulate the view of the culture. You do become the Borg. So that by the time you become a chief executive, it's kind of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you know? You went to sleep a person and somebody put a pod under your bed and you woke up going, blah, 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 blah. And you articulate the truth that serves the culture, and that's how we advance in cultures. A friend of mine who's both a Roman Catholic and a cop tells me the cultures are very similar. He said, when you're put on the street as a cop, he said, the first thing everybody does is watch how you handle when there's dirty money passing around or something's going down or your buddies are in an alley beating the living hell out of somebody. They watch what you do in response. And if you're okay, the word goes around real quick. You're one of us. And then you're on the fast track. And if you're not okay, if you're Serpico or one of those guys, you'll get work. But it's not going to be good work, and it will be dangerous work, and you're not going to move up. And he said, as a disappointed Catholic, he said, you know, I guess the same thing happens in the church. The bishops who sustained and enabled culture of pedophilia, criminality, became bishops of Boston and Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. And the one who blew the whistle wound up being sent to Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is the way institutions work. People are rewarded or punished according to the rules that were in place when they came into the system. And as you work your way up to the system, you reward the system using the same rules that rewarded you, so you can be trusted to sustain it when you get to the top. Okay. Now, in the security world and in the intelligence world, the work itself, because it often brings us face to face, if we're paying attention, with really darker truths, can have a profound impact on us. I was thinking of someone I knew who had a black hat, suddenly began sobbing, not weeping a little, but sobbing. And I just held him because he'd done work behind the scenes for an intelligence community, and the mission that he was supporting resulted in the death of 11 people. And he was terrified that he had not done everything he could have done to make it work, to get everything they needed, to know everything they needed to know. Well, in the world we live in, he couldn't. He did everything a human being could do, but humans are often powerless. Another gentleman, he just start drinking heavily. It's not uncommon, right? Start drinking heavily because somebody he had turned in another country was discovered and tortured to death, and he felt responsible for the screams of the man. It really affects us to do the work that brings home to us the dark side of human experience. Computer security seems or can seem antiseptic because our hands are on switches. Like if you're doing a bombing run in Vietnam, I remember a guy who wrote the book called Air War. Some of you don't remember. How many of you remember the Vietnam War? Okay, not many. How many of you who don't remember it know that there was a Vietnam War? It's no joke, wandering around the con, looking deluded. Guy who wrote Air War talked about how easy it was, video screen, push the button, or work a drone from Nellis, just north of us, and drop bombs and sometimes make mistakes. So there can be an antiseptic distance that prevents that feedback loop, turns these things into externalities, but sometimes the screams come home. Sometimes it can come home even in a secondary way. I was once trying to interest the bioethicists in my city of Milwaukee in things that weren't in public then, but I was talking to people both who tortured other people and who were tortured. So listening, I was in the ministry, and you learn to you just sit and listen. You open yourself, you empathize, you listen with compassion when someone describes what torture was like. Or the torturer, on the other hand, who said what fun it was to work with the Uzbeks. And I said, why was it fun to work with the Uzbeks? He said, because for them it was a novelty when we told them that one of the purposes of harsh interrogation was to get information. You got it? They didn't know that, it has a purpose. And I mentioned that to someone who's really good at interrogation, done it for 17 years, and he said, do you ever work with the Turks? Turks just want a confession. Doesn't have to be a crime or a perp. Got a paper? You're going to sign it. So I was talking to people on both sides, and all I could do was try to connect the people who told me about it because it afflicted them with subcommittees in Congress or the right journalists if they were willing to risk a great deal about their careers and lives by becoming whistleblowers, about which I'll say a little more later. So I was trying to get bioethicists and therapists at the medical college and other places in Milwaukee to make this worthy of investigation rather than just doctors' issues. And one of the therapists said, you really ought to read this stuff on trauma, which I did. She told me books to read. And I came back and she said, do you know why I asked you to read those books? I said, sure, because I'm talking to people who are heavily traumatized. And she said, any other reason? And I said, no, because when you're in it, you can't see it. As I said, you can't think it. And she said, you're showing the effects of secondary trauma. They're all there. And my wife said, as wives will, I could have told you that a year ago. Well, actually what she said was, I told you that a year ago. And you couldn't listen. And the sequelae, as they tell them, the manifestation of the symptoms of secondary trauma are very clear, and I had them all. And it's why a friend from NSA, we sat in the car in the rain, and he said, you're over the line. You're over the line. You are in the Hall of Mirrors. You know a lot of things are true, and you're very good at connecting dots and all, and you know more than I do, in fact, he said, because I'm compartmented, about which more later. But you don't know what's really, really true about this stuff you're learning, some of it. And you get anxious. So what I'm trying to suggest is, be real with yourselves, or spouse, or significant other, or rent-a-person, or whatever you use in your life to ameliorate the chill of the night. Just be real when you're getting feedback about the fact that your work has an impact on you. A paper was written not long ago about, the name of it is Security Pros May Be Ready to Crack Under Growing Pressure. Faced with securing personal devices and a growing base of threats, security pros feel overwhelmed. Why? Because you can't do security. And because it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get more and more certain that what you're doing is kind of like the doctor in the book by John Hersey, Hiroshima, who was in his office, and there was a flash, and he didn't know what it was, and then some people came in, and they were burning, and they had arms peeling, and he just didn't know what it was. But he took the first couple, and he sat them down. He started to treat them fully and carefully, completely. And then when he turned around, there were 7 or 8 more, and he said, well, just sit here. And then when he turned around again, he was on the third person, but now there are 50 in the office, and he looks out the window, and there are hundreds streaming toward his office. And he was reduced to saying, as he went from person to person to person, they're there. They're there. They're there. Because he had been totally disabled as an agent of care and performance. It's kind of like, where did that echo from just now? Catch-22, when Yossarian, I don't remember the name of the guy who had taken a hit with flak and his stomach was open. He opened, what was it? Yeah, thank you. And all he could do as he looked at the man pour out was say, they're there, they're there. You come to a conference like this, we're well fed, air conditioning might be, the worst thing that happens is I'm on a high floor and it took a couple minutes for the shower to warm up. The food might not be exactly what your San Francisco dietitian tells you must eat in order to be perfectly healthy. I have 3 kids in San Francisco. You don't need that. Okay, but the point is, in an environment like this, we ameliorate with food, drink, and camaraderie, which I love. That's why I come in part. These effects that I'm talking about, because you may not be ready to crack up, but I'm saying you got to pay attention to how you rationalize and deal with the facts of the impossibility of doing the job you tell people you do. And when you go on the vendor floor and listen to the vendors tell you what it is that this or that is going to do, I think of what Jane Wagner said. She said, I keep getting more and more cynical all the time, and I still can't keep up. So, those of you who are young will think that is cynical. Those of you who are silverbacks will know it is merely realism. So, what does it do to a human being to live with all this? I sat with a guy from NSA and a guy from the FBI in Washington having dinner, and they were burdened with their secrets. And this business is about secrets. And they said, think about what it's like to sit there with the headphones on listening in close detail to someone having their throat cut by a terrorist, and you're listening to the gurgling and the screams and the horror, and you go home at night and your wife says, "How was your day?" And you can only say, "It was fine, dear." It has an impact. That guy who started drinking, I mean, this is a good example because it kind of shows you the dividing line in this talk. That guy who started drinking because he was so plagued with the person who was outed, tortured, and killed, he was sent to a therapist. The agencies all have therapists, and the therapists are all cleared. And I said to a friend, but isn't the purpose of a therapist that is cleared by the agency to get you back in shape enough to do your job? In other words, the purpose of therapy is not wholeness, integrity, and health, which is the kind I thought it was when I was doing counseling. The purpose is to get you off the drink so you can be a better functioning person doing the same job you did that put you in that shape in the first place. And he said, yes, that is the purpose of therapy in the agency, to just get you back in the saddle. And I said, what happens if you can't do that? He said, then we watch you very, 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 very carefully. And that's a different state of mind than the one that's optimally healthy, in which you go into therapy in order to find out what's really true for you, what you really feel, what you really think, in order to make decisions that are congruent with it and aligned with it. And all I'm saying is that this work in particular can have a blowback effect that makes that difficult to do. So all I'm asking is that we tell the truth to ourselves and confront the reality of our lives. When Nietzsche said it, he wasn't kidding. He spent the last 10 years of his life mad. He said, whoever battles monsters should take care not to become a monster too, for if you stare long enough into the abyss stares back into you. He was saying the same thing. There's a sign at Sandia Labs. It says, do not look directly into the laser beam with your remaining eye. It's the, it's the same kind of advice, right? In other words, be mindful and be vigilant. Okay, so discussions of security and the security industry often focus on statements about security, but security has a context, and context has to turn into content. I always use Eddie Bernays as an example of context into content, because he saw how to change the context to get a result that nobody saw was happening on the side, but which was really the primary result. Any of you know about the Torches of Freedom parade in the 1920s? Does that ring a bell with anybody? Women used to smoke, but only in their homes. In the 1920s, it was not socially acceptable for women to smoke outside the home. And the tobacco company, which is coming up again, went to Eddie Bernays and said, how can we get women to smoke outside the home? Well, every Easter Sunday in New York, down Fifth Avenue, women paraded. It was called the Easter Day Parade. Well, he changed it. He said, I know what we're going to do, because there was a strong feminist movement. You know, feminism didn't come in the 60s, the 1890s, 20s, comes in waves, stronger and stronger and stronger as social and political conditions support its emergence and power. And so there were suffragettes and women who we would call feminists. And they were ready to take bold action to show they could do anything men could do. And that included smoking in public. So Eddie Bernays had the tobacco companies give all the women free cigarettes. And when they had the parade on Easter Sunday, they all marched down Fifth Avenue smoking daringly, boldly, and openly in public. And it was called the Torches of Freedom. The Torches of Freedom. So what he did is he would change the context so that people would not see what they were doing and then do the behavior that was desired. So what security is really about in the real world is what works. What works? What really works? You know, I was in the ministry, and that confuses people because they think either you're bad or you're good. Neither is true. It's just a person who happens to find themselves for a lot of reasons in the ministry. And you go to different places to stay trued up. And I went to the Zen Center in San Francisco, and the monk came out, you know, on a platform like this, and he bowed, and everybody, you don't do it because you're security professionals, but everybody there, because they're at the Zen Center, they got up and they bowed back. And he said, thank you. And he said, do you know why we bow at the Zen Center? And everybody knew they were supposed to sound religious because the context encouraged it. They said, oh, we're bowing to acknowledge the samadhi and the enlightenment and the Godhead and one another. And he was very kind and compassionate. Being a monk, he had to do that in his persona out front. And so he said, no, that's very good, but not what I'm after. And finally he said, no, we bow here because, well, things pretty much work better when we bow. Okay? So that was... That was his definition of spirituality, and it's become something I've never forgotten. Practical spirituality, practical reality is what pretty much works better when we do that, and it doesn't work pretty much better when we don't do it. And so this means plunging into the dark side. James Baldwin said the price one pays for pursuing any profession or calling is an intimate knowledge of its ugly side. We find in spiritual journeys that that's true of us as selves as well. So Plato was right, know yourself. Know yourself as an individual and know yourself in relationship to the space in which you work. And that requires a different kind of analysis. We call it deep political structure, deep politics. Peter Dale Scott, great interesting professor at Berkeley, University of California, wrote a book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. It wasn't a, quote, conspiracy theory, unquote, book. It was about the death of JFK. I mean, plenty of stuff doesn't line up. 50 years anniversary, we're probably going to find out more about that. But a lot of stuff doesn't line up. You know how it's inflected. Dulles, who was head of the CIA, hated Kennedy, who fired him. He was put on the Warren Commission report. And after the assassination, he came and said to the committee, now you know every time there's been an assassination in America, including this one, it's a lone gunman. It's some anomalous event. It's a crazy. And someone said, but when Lincoln was shot, there was also a plot to kill the vice president and other people all at the same time. And he said, exactly. Exactly. In other words, A is B and B is A, and we don't really know who killed Kennedy, and that wasn't the purpose of Scott's book. It was to show that so many people wanted Kennedy dead because the deep politics of America is so permeated with criminality and darkness. And he did an analysis which simply showed what kinds of things Kennedy and his father and his brother were involved in, what they were doing with the intelligence community at the time, what they were doing in their broken promises with the mafia. You know, I grew up in Chicago. You know, I mean, Charlie Fischetti lived in the penthouse above me in Lakeshore Drive, where I grew up. When he had a heart attack in Miami, we kids went up and found 13 wall safes. So we're pretty well versed. I think I was about 10 when I woke up one night and I said, my God, the father of every friend I have in Chicago does something illegal. And that was kind of a wake-up call. People elsewhere tell me that that was an unusual insight, that other places it's not true. I think it is, but you just don't know it. And so a lot of the people I worked with growing up, it distorted my view, but the mob in Chicago is one of the contextual elements with which you always must contend, and the politics is corrupt to the core. It's just the way Chicago is. Vegas, where we are now, look at how wonderful it is. It started as a place to launder money for Kansas City, Detroit, and Chicago, and got built here in the desert about 50 or 60 years ago. And the Skim is what went back into the Midwest and the mafias that ran it then. And a deep political analysis looks at the distinction between traditional conspiracy theory, you know, which always posits a small group of cabal-like people, conscious secret collaborations toward shared ends, and deep political analysis, which is the study of all those practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, but which we usually repress rather than acknowledge. In other words, he said, in the open society that we think we live in, there's an open system with divergent power centers and goals. There's no single objective or control point, but there is a deep interleaving or intersection of the dark and the light in a yin-yang-y kind of way. In Chicago, for example, I learned the criminal structures were tolerated by the police. See the latest Whitey Bulger deal, working with the FBI. Much police work is done through informants, and informants are people who are turned and tolerated, like the guns going to Mexico that killed our own people, but they enabled us, we thought, would enable us to find people at a higher level in the structure. In Chicago, the police-criminal symbiosis is complete, and the mob controls more than the police department because, starting in the Vegas days, going way back in Chicago as I grew up, it has corrupted and controls all of civic life in the degree to which it permeates civic life and in the degree to which the economic and political system acts with points of reference for power according to what it doesn't say rather than what it does say. Next, as a result of technology changing over the years, morphing geopolitical structures into what we now call metanational stage-managed globalism, what we've seen is a migration from the intelligence community into all of business. And a marker of that for me was years ago when Jan Herring from the CIA went to Motorola as the head of competitive intelligence. Because what that said is, as what we then called transnational companies with headquarters in cities in America, for example, but with operations in the world, grew and developed, it became essential for them to have the same kind of intelligence, counterintelligence, and deception capacities as what we had called nation states. Now, where did nation states come from? In the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, nation states emerged as an appropriate structure. Think of it now. Identity is defined by boundaries, and the boundaries that we needed as information began to speed in its flow into and out of more and more complex systems, the boundaries needed to be around larger social, economic, and political entities. And they emerged as what we called nation states, within which we then lived as if they were real. And what the transnational corporations were doing was undermining the structure of those nation states and their relationship to one another. And now we have meta-national structures, which are different again. They are not rooted in any particular country. They exist kind of like the Cloud City in The Empire Strikes Back, floating in the sky, doing business down here where we live in the rain. But their points of reference for power are other than the political discourse would lead us to believe. I did a talk for the FBI not too long ago, a couple months ago, and the head of the chief agent in charge of the office in Chicago was present. And I like to test these insights, these meta-insights, these abstractions that occur to me. And he said, well, yeah, he said, we used to be able to approach somebody on the basis of patriotism and invite them on behalf of the nation to do X and Y. And while they still want to do that, they find that it often conflicts with the true source of their power, money, influence, and longevity. So there's a real conflict. And he had said too, he said, you know, it's not your father's FBI. We were built to be a police agency in America. And now we do a lot of intelligence work overseas. And at the same time, the CIA was built to be an intelligence agency sanctioned by law to break all the laws in all the other countries but never operate here. But now, just as the FBI must operate elsewhere, the CIA and other intelligence agencies must also operate here, because the boundaries around those nation states have become so fluid, so liquid, so porous as a result of globalism, which in fact depends on IT more than any other thing in the revolution through which we have now lived, that when we talk as if the political discourse that we just heard, as if we are a nation that makes decisions that aren't relevant, that are relevant only to ourselves, it just doesn't work that way anymore. It just doesn't work that way anymore, because the boundaries, while they still exist for functionality, like civic entities still exist and states, the real sources of power in the world, this is not a conspiracy theory, this is simply observation, are elsewhere, and they are metanational. They are people acting according to motivations that are not determined by their national allegiance. Okay? So this results in a high degree of skepticism when people speak. I've spoken for Microsoft a couple of times in Israel, and once the other person on the platform was Steve Ballmer. And they said, you know why we really had you come here? They couldn't say it out loud. He said, no, why? I said, so you can give credibility to Steve Ballmer. Because they knew that if he said, we're taking seriously security, no one would believe it. But I still had a reputation for integrity and independence. This is my cachet, integrity and independence. It doesn't always sell well, but it sells enough. And I am accused by friends, the reason you talk to these people, they say, is so they can bleed off their guilt and shame and pain and then get back to work. So I have things to think about too. In other words, it's all gray. We all have mixed motivations, don't we? So when I did a talk for the New Paradigms in Security workshop, I could address information security professionals and intelligence people directly about the fact that foreign and domestic no longer mean anything, any more than artificial and natural mean a binary distinction when we're making organisms and doing transgenic work and doing genetic engineering, and I've been talking about biohacking for several years. Foreign and domestic just doesn't mean anything except as an illusion. And so what's happened to IT and security professionals? We now exercise an implicit de facto thought leadership, because you create the structures that bind and inform society and civilization. Your real implicit charge is not to defend and protect the nation, but to stabilize a world. Put it this way, the dire possibility of societal disintegration elevates the responsibility of the community to a higher level. Linked in cooperative activity, intelligence professionals in the trenches now, where they exchange data, the origin and destination of which they may not know, because of all sorts of things like false flag operations and deception. They are responsible for maintaining social and global order at a higher level of understanding, far beyond that formulated in the past by a single nation. See, the intelligence community originally was sanctioned by the state to defend and protect and then project power on behalf of the state. And that's what's disintegrating. So de facto, we have formed for the intelligence community, in the aggregate, practitioners who share an ethos and a modality of operation not available to ordinary citizens, and who have thereby created for themselves an intrinsic vocation or calling to maintain global order. And that's what I defined as reassuring the world that the world in which you wake up will be pretty much like the world in which you went to sleep. That's the definition of security. It's to say they're there when things happen, and it's to fix things as best we can. So, it may sound like conspiracy theory, but I was talking to some Air Force OSI guys, and first they started, oh, the UFO guy, gonna go there. And then after we talked for about 20 minutes, I said, so do I still sound like a crazy, deranged? No, he said, actually everything you say, he said, that's right. That's exactly how it works. That's right. And then they say what I love. I saw something the other day. And then I don't take out a pencil and pen, I just run to the restroom and take out a pencil and pen. And I have a story to illustrate the next talk. But the point is, this is pretty much the way it is. That's what I'm trying to describe. So stability, the persistence of structures, even as they rapidly change, a continuity of identity for illusory nations, illusory corporate structures, and our illusory selves, which is a whole other talk about what's happening to identity as it becomes corporate and is refashioned and contextualized by technology. In effect, we now have to manage cellular changes, environmental disruptions, and genetic mutations in the security world the way biology has done so successfully through DNA. Next, we do this in the context of a different kind of world. Take my word for it. This is what Silverback is good for. There is a secretive world within the secret world, which since 9/11 has grown and grown and grown. When it was described, this is not bad, it's just what's so. When it was described when the Dernsa called people together in his office and said, this is what the new executive order has asked us to do. And these senior people at the agency stood there, and the silence was so thick you could cut it. Why? Because they'd spent their whole professional and personal lives believing that's not what we can do. That's illegal. That's a violation of the Constitution. We are not. Now, this has all come out now, but at the time it hadn't come out. At the time it was a shock to them and it was a shock to those of us who learned of it. We're going to gobble up all of the communications of Americans that we need to gobble up at the source. Because why? Foreign and domestic don't mean anything anymore. You couldn't tell where a communication originated or where it was going. You had to catch it on the fly, and that was a non-geographical space. And therefore, the Fourth Amendment search and seizure must be recontextualized to make sense, as a friend at NSA says, in a world without walls. He said, so we're still asking all the wrong questions, as if it was the 20th century, and as if the world still had walls. And meanwhile, in 1947, when CIA and now a lot of other agencies and organizations were empowered, and then 9/11, it went squared and cubed. The top secret world the government created in response to terrorist attacks, said Dana Priest, pretty good journalist, has become so large, so unwieldy, and so secretive that no one knows how much money it costs, how many people it employs, how many programs exist within it, or exactly how many agencies do the same work. 1,271 government organizations and 2,000 private companies work on programs related to counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence in 10,000 locations across the country. 850,000 people have top secret security clearances. 33 building complexes for top secret intelligence work are under construction or have been built just since 9/11. Many security and intelligence agencies do the same work, creating redundancy and waste. And analysts who make sense of documents publish 50,000 intelligence reports per year, a volume so large that many are routinely ignored. In the book that was mentioned in the introduction, Mind Games, which of course is always available, I have a story in there called Break Memory, in which the masters of society describe how it is that they manage memory in the population by creating algorithms that enable them to distribute memories in a population that's increasing in longevity and therefore is a threat, because silverbacks might sit next to one another on a bench in St. Petersburg and talk about the same thing. So they have to distribute the memories so people are never quite juxtaposed with the right people with whom they might share commonality and talk about things and build the big picture, because the big picture that we're talking about today is the enemy. And so the masters of society, you know how the bell curve looks. It looks like this. And there's 10%, and those are the masters. They do this. Then there's 80%, a big hump. In the 80% of the hump, they're humplings. What humplings do is hump along. That's what you do. Then the 10% at the end are the dregs. Looks like a little tail. The masters keep the dregs, so the humplings are happy they're not dregs, because they can see the dregs and say, oh, thank God my income isn't at that level. Oh, thank God I'm not out of work for 3 years, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, the poor dregs. And the masters keep the whole hump humping along, inchworm-like, into the future, and everybody is happy. No one knows what it looks like. Nobody knows what the national security state really looks like. A friend calls it a rabbit hole. You just go deeper and deeper and deeper. In the meantime, how much money are we spending on it? Extraordinary amount. The lesson here is that you cannot separate security from the vast dark cave of secrecy in which it takes place, the world of black and gray operations, of military and intelligence work, a world within the world with massive engines of funding, and therefore we now live within the military, industrial, media, entertainment, educational complex, which are all nexuses or nexi of power and influence, and you can find them like dye in the arteries by following the money and looking at the cash flow. And this is what underlies when you look at the deeper political and economic structure of the security industry. It is embedded in that, and it never talks about it. It never talks about it at conferences like these. It never says it aloud. It never tells itself the truth. And so what kinds of behaviors result? Let me see where I am, because these are important things I want to make sure I say. Okay. Here's an example from vendor space. There are a lot of vendors up there, all good and true men and women, every single one of them. Stalwart men and women doing good work. Okay, having said that, an example. Here's someone who says, we deal with vendors every day. The vendor is brought to us by an enterprise that's licensing code from the vendor, either to deploy internally using software they're bundling or bundle. We analyze the code. There is resistance from the vendor to send their code to us. It ranges from this is a pain in the ass, but I have to, or I'm going to complain, or no way, I'm not going to let you do a third-party assessment. Where a vendor falls along the spectrum parallels the economic leverage the enterprise customer has over the vendor. If the enterprise is the size of Barclays or Dell and the vendor is small, the vendor capitulates. The vendor and the customer are the same size, then there's hemming and hawing, but the vendor will probably give in. If the vendor is huge and the customer is smaller than the US government, the vendor says no, because they have market power. It's kind of like the US not going along with international treaties or the court in Hague when it wants to apply itself to us. They don't go along with it because they can get away with it. So these are assumptions deeply embedded in the structure of vendor space that are never said aloud. A security expert who I think knows really what he's talking about, we stood and we looked out at the vendor space another time, and he said, you know, every single one of those people is selling something that cannot do what they claim, which is to secure the enterprise. The editor of a national magazine, when I said to him about a story I was supposed to write, I said, this whole thing is based on smoke and mirrors, this engine they've got. And he said, Richard, like a father to a child, our whole industry is based on smoke and mirrors. 10 years ago, Neil Stephenson made the point at CFP, Computers, Freedom, and Privacy about code. He said relying on a encryption scheme is like trying to protect your house with a fence consisting of a single very tall picket. You remember the cartoon? One picket standing up and a little bird trying to decide which side to fly around. In other words, we identify the threats that we can fight, and those we name and those we address. We do not identify the threats we cannot fight. And that's why cryptography is the opiate of the naive. Peter Neumann was talking to Ron Rivest about voting machines, which Neumann explained were broken. And Ron Rivest was talking about the cryptography. And he said, but the cryptography that we've got on those voting machines is really great. And Neumann said, yes, but the machine itself, the system itself, is broken. And Rivest said, that's not my problem. Not my problem. Security vendors sell solutions that address our fears, real or imaginary, and they sell the tools that can do what they can do. They can't sell the tools that can't do what they can't do. Antivirus, as you know, does not stop at least 20% of what comes at it, and once you are owned, you are owned. Making security powerful and invisible to the user is not the first imperative. Go upstairs and go through these talks, and time after time after time, there's the chortle chuckle joy of cracking, breaking, and opening. And seldom is there the solid, deep, old man pleasure of defending. It just doesn't sell. It's not as sexy. I remember a hacker laughing at the ATM and other embedded device code he was looking at because it was so simple and easy to exploit. In my non-expert opinion, this friend went on, I would say the cell phone stuff is even easier. Mobile device security implementations currently suck more ass, excuse me, that's what he said, than the abomination that we call mainstream software. Okay? And this is all happening. Thank you. I mean, I think some of the chuckles just recognize that I'm simply, by saying this is what people talk about off-site, telling the truth. And all happening in the dark cave, where the intelligence community, the security world, and multinational corporations cooperate in behaviors mandated by success, political, economic, and social, in which we have all become complicit and all have been assimilated into the model or paradigm. And what does that have to do with what we mean by the word security? As one noted, if warrantless tapping of the phone system in the internet is okay and can be secret, what assurances do I have from Google that they aren't the NSA's largest database? Or as General Michael Hayden said, a quote. I mean, think about it, a quote. When asked by someone if tapping the phones of Americans might have ethical or legal issues to which they should attend, he said, we don't have to worry about them because, quote, we have the power, unquote. Head of Homeland Security, former head of NSA. You can't make it up, right? And so what happens as the cage turns? One of my sons was upset when he saw the movie Bridesmaids, not because it wasn't funny, it was really funny. Even guys like Bridesmaids. I went to see it as a result, and it was really funny. But there's a scene in there where she goes to the cop and says, you gotta, or he, whoever it was, says, you gotta find so-and-so. And the cop, as a favor, went to the radio and said, use the GPS, and came out and said they're at home. What my son noticed was the medicine goes down so easy with sugar like that, right? It was the normalization of the national security state to show a cop breaking the law by using GPS and the apparatus in his control to do a favor for a friend, whatever the favor was. The point is people laughed, which made them assimilate the lesson that this is okay, this is normal. And so the cage turns, and the real birds, secure in their flocking, look at each other's wings. So warrantless wiretapping of Americans is okay then, according to our leaders. Building the information systems we have built is permission to use them for whatever they can be used to do by anyone and everyone, and that's why they are. Regardless of the intention of the builder, attribution of an attack in cyberspace is child's play compared to attribution of responsibility for building a system so complex that no one can possibly understand it. Dan Geer said, quote one by name here, the financial world has proven by demonstration that we humans are abundantly capable of building systems we can neither understand nor control. The digital world is insisting on a second round of proof. Just as the greatest enemy of our personal health is ubiquitous cheap food, the greatest enemy of our national health is ubiquitous cheap connectivity. Someone said to him years ago, your choice is not one big brother or no big brothers, it's one big brother or many little brothers. The evidence is in, we have both. The FBI is at it again. Some of you remember COINTELPRO. The DVD has about 35 pages with lots of documentation. Let me just say that the FBI has documented committing over 800 violations of the law from 2001 to 2008. Violations of law, executive order, governing intelligence investigations. The details are in there. It's just more stuff. We're not alone. Emil Durkheim pointed out in the 19th century, great sociologist, the criminality and normal legitimate society interpenetrate one another deeply and necessarily, that criminals perform a profound good for society. And he spelled it out, and I don't have time to spell out all the things he spelled out, but he was saying that in effect we're in collusion with criminals all the time. What I'm saying growing up in Chicago is it became clear that we were in collusion with corruption all the time. I worked for an alderman for 4 years going through Northwestern. If he had 4 ways to do something and 3 were legal and 1 was illegal, he would do it illegally just to keep his integrity intact. He never once asked me to do something legal. Never once. And I was just a kid. And I observed what he did. And it's just deeply permeating, but we never say it. We talk about it in this narrative up here in the sunlight, as if that's a different world than the one we describe. But it gets worse than this. I can't go over all the examples, but this web is extensive, and it is dark, and it is pervasive. When I was in the Netherlands, I didn't let them off the hook. I could point out Franco-Dutch airline Air France, KLM, faced a 250 million euro fine because they were price fixing. They've been accused of price fixing for 11 years. Now, where does the security business, where does infosecurity derive its first marching orders, if not the intelligence community? It's from the financial services industry. We are told up front, one of the first and best and necessary things to do is protect the financial services industry. It was the rationale for the bailout, so that we can protect the system or structure within which everything else derives its purpose and energy. But are U.S. banks complicit in this? There's a lot of documentation in here, not just the banks I'm going to mention, but banks from all over the world. Money laundering is enormous by any measure. U.S. and European banks launder between $500 billion and $1 trillion of dirty money every year, half of which is laundered by U.S. banks alone. Estimates are that $500 billion to $1 trillion of international criminal proceeds, this is Carl Levin, senator, are moved internationally and deposited into bank accounts annually, and half of it comes from the United States. Okay? It's circulated in U.S. financial circuits. A leading U.S. scholar, an expert on international finance, says the flow of corrupt money out of developing third world and transitional ex-communist economies into Western coffers is 20 to 40 billion. In other words, an incomplete figure of dirty money, laundered, criminal, and corrupt money flowing into the U.S. during the 1990s alone was $3.5 to $5.5 trillion. It's not the whole picture, but it gives us a basis to estimate the significance of the dirty money in our economy. Without it, our economy would not be sustainable. Living standards would plummet, the dollar would weaken, the available investment and loan capital would shrink, and Washington would not be able to sustain its global empire. U.S. banks are deeply complicit, as are banks all over the world, often through correspondent relationships with small banks that don't have access to large sources of capital in the international markets. So when you look at Wells Fargo or Wachovia being fined millions, $100, $200 million because they laundered over $1 trillion, and they laundered so much money from Mexico that it amounted to 1/3 of the GDP of the Mexican economy. And their excuse was they didn't notice that. No one noticed it. Now the point is just this, when you talk about security, how many people were killed in 9/11? Less than 3,000. Bad thing, but we talk about it like it's everything. How many have been killed in the cartel wars? Over 35,000. And the way they are killed is often much more cruel than the jet hitting a building and the building falling. It really is. 35,000. More than 10 times as many are dead. And what enables the cartel wars to take place? Drugs, right? And who sustains the drug economy? The banks that launder the money from the people who do it. Bank of America has a beautiful statement that they put out about why they're opposed to laundering, blah, 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 blah. But when you look at, in fact, what Bank of America does, and what Barclays does, and what the Vatican Bank does, and what banks in the Middle East do, and on and on and on, they all are complicit. My point is simply, when we talk about what I work for, and then fill in the blank of the financial institution, and derive derivative status and a sense of pride and power from naming the name on the plate or the statue in front of the beautiful glass building in New York or Chicago or San Francisco, we do not tell ourselves the real truth about what it is in fact we're doing. We're trying to secure their enterprise on behalf of a purpose which is not at all what we say we are doing. And so when I talk about coming to an ethical crossroads, where you might find yourself having to think about things, it comes up where people sometimes wait and call me later and say, what do I do with this one? Here's a guy who in the 90s went into, it's long enough so you don't have to worry about it, he went to Haiti on a counterintelligence mission to take care of a drug trafficking ring that was moving a lot of money through Haiti at the time. In the late 90s, that was one of the routes. And his mission was to interdict that traffic and shut down that route. And he got to Haiti, and as often happens in Haiti, it was politically chaotic, and he was afraid they were going to lose the mission. And then he heard somebody was coming down, as it happened, this was the 90s, from Arkansas, to make sure that he thought the mission stayed on track. And he was very glad to hear the news until the guy got down there, and he found out that what he really wanted to do was make sure that the route stayed open. It had to land somewhere. Maine, Arkansas is as good a place as any. And he said, what the hell am I doing? Or the security professional who worked for a stock exchange in New York and was asked to do intrusion detection. And he did it, and he showed him all the data. And they said, great. And he said, we could do more. We can do intrusion prevention. We can stop a lot of this. And they said, no, you're doing wonderful. Just keep bringing the reports. He said, that didn't make any sense until he found out that the people on the board of the stock exchange were the ones doing the intrusion in order to have insider information with which they could then trade to their own advantage. So they didn't want him to stop the attacks because they were the attackers. And he said the same way. What am I doing? What am I doing? So all I'm encouraging you to do is ask the question, what are you doing? 10 minutes? I'll be darned. Okay. Okay, Barclays, go over that. Oh, and it's so good, it's such good stuff. It's all on the DVD, you can look at it. So it puts you in a position, Gary Webb was a friend of mine. He wrote Dark Alliance. It was about the complicity within CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine enterprise. And he did a masterful piece of journalism, and he was, of course, destroyed for doing it. He lost his job. Editors wouldn't back him when the questions were raised. I called him one night when I was pursuing something that scared the hell out of me, and I said, is it worth it? It was midnight. You know, one of those calls, you're sitting alone in your study, and you've got some data in front of you that you're saying, oh, shit. I said, Gary, was it worth it? He'd lost so much then. And he said, was it worth it? Yes. The CIA later, always enough later so there's never accountability, admitted it. I know it was the truth. That's what kept me going. I knew I was right. My eyes were open. I knew what I was getting into. My kids suffered. I thought I had the paper behind me. I didn't. Support came from all kinds of places, especially African Americans who were victimized by the crack. My wife was used to me getting death threats. Then he said, you get one chance in a lifetime to do the right thing. If you don't do it, you surrender, and then they win. These are the worst people on earth that you're dealing with. They lie, they plant stories, they discredit people, and worse, for a living, they have the resources and they have the experience to do it. But somebody's got to do what we do, otherwise they win. Later, when he was reduced to almost nothing except his motorcycle was divorced, his life was falling apart, the only thing he had was his beloved motorcycle, and he came out of his ex-wife's house, and the motorcycle was gone. Someone had stolen it, and he went home and he shot himself. Now, all I'm saying is those words echo through my mind. If we don't do it, they win. And what I keep finding myself saying is, who wins? Who wins? What are you doing? Attacks are sexy, yeah, and the sky is continuing to fall. Very few defensive technologies and techniques presented at conferences like these. Finding ways to actually deal with the fact that organizations are getting owned every day by people who are targeting specific access is met with a test pattern. In my opinion, said one, the focus is still on stuff to be placed on top of a flawed underlying foundation, so we can never really get to acceptable levels of InfoSec unless either we rip out the networks and start from scratch, or change the competence of corporate and government InfoSec people to not tolerate mediocrity and empower them with authority, resources, and support to do what it takes to, quote, do it right, which is what we say we're about. Otherwise, we're throwing good money after bad and perpetuating the status quo. I don't do pen tests anymore or red teaming because people don't really learn from our findings. They just want to check the box. So why bother? I'm not making a tangible difference anymore. If clients don't care, except for making a nice profit or a gig to offer recommendations that I know will be ignored, why should I? Okay, another said the problem is, to tell the truth, one has to be, one, not a vendor, and two, willing to spill the beans on getting owned. There are very few people who will get up and say, I work security, my job is to prevent intrusions, we get owned a lot, so I kind of fail at my job, sometimes it is really bad, and here is how we deal with it. Another said, even when we do our jobs correctly, we're still going to get owned. The challenge is getting business leaders to accept that reality and allow us to redirect funding to deal with the reality. Attacks can be simple, delivered by one guy. Defense is boring. We all know what to do, but it's not a technology problem, it's a business problem. Okay, one more set of quotes, which I think kind of wraps it up, and then we'll conclude. So what is the real state of our craft? A gentleman said. A lot of people aren't willing to ask the hard questions because they haven't come to the realization that what we've got is fundamentally broken. There are folks out there still trying to perfect AV and IDS mousetraps. I suggest no big data solution will magically solve the problem of I have to see it first in order to detect it later brokenness that represents the foundation of the majority of our controls. Why raise this important step? Because I wonder if one can even have an honest dialogue about fundamental change without acknowledging the need for the dialogue. This stuff doesn't work. Now let's start the hard conversation about changing it. Our inability to accurately identify and convey technology risk kills us. What is the cost of Adobe Reader vulnerabilities when they're used to steal your CAD diagrams and result in knockoff parts being manufactured in China? That conversation needs to happen at executive levels, and if we don't start having it, we have zero hope of moving forward. Okay? A lot of the shocking public realizations that have transpired in the last 24 months, Zeus, WikiLeaks, Stuxnet, HBG, are the formalized and weaponized materializations of what we knew was possible all along. Software security problems in all sorts of goods and services, check. Greater societal dependence on the technology, check. Greater complexity, check. People selling 0 days to God knows who for money, check. Professional development of digital weaponry, check. Black market economy, check. Industrial espionage, check. Leaked information, targeted information, traded information, check. Intelligence agencies outside the U.S. with growing capabilities, check. Iran threatening to retaliate by doing preemptive strikes after Stuxnet, check. Real-world ramifications to all of the above, check. In short, I guess it basically comes down to handling risk. You assume the worst risk possible and proceed to develop trust models that don't fully mitigate all risks. You are simply mitigating your fear. It's not how much security do I need until I have no risk, it's how much do I need until I can live comfortably with the risks I feel I am still facing. So we wind up once again where we started. The price one pays for pursuing any profession or calling is an intimate knowledge of its ugly side. And just like spiritual growth in the individual being, if you do not look at, acknowledge, and integrate in yourself all of the darkness as well, you will never be whole and complete and have integrity. You will live in that never land of impossibility and delusion. You will be a real bird in a digital flock in a digital cage. Whoever battles monsters should be careful. If you stare long enough into the abyss stares into you. Security is not just implementation of software and hardware, it's the creation of a geopolitical structure that let us believe that tomorrow will be okay to wake up in. It is ameliorating the real anxieties of life, but we often use fictitious narratives to do it. I think we can do it better with the truth. It's not just redefining our terms. British Rail had a terrible problem with trains being late, so they redefined on time to mean not 15 minutes, but an hour. And the on-time rate got much better. And as I said, Dulles told the commission, everybody's killed by a lone gunman, and when someone said, but they weren't, and he says, exactly. If that doesn't prove that we live in a batshit crazy world, I don't know what does. So how can we use the word security as if we mean security? How can you respond to the real problems of the profession? How can you turn this into a we, not a they? How can you have the courage, inch by inch, to move this thing forward in accordance with the truth which we all know? So when I call it the dark side, it's not really the dark side any more than hackers are dark side hackers. They're just hackers. It's just humanity I'm talking about. It's us at home. It's who we are. It's who we work with. It's how the world works. And we don't really need Hollywood-type scenarios to delude us into thinking that things are sweeter than they are, or Cassandra's to say they're worse than they are. They're bad enough. Right? So at this point, somebody has a hand up? Question? I've heard of you.
And I've observed the pressure that is on young people over the years in this space, and in the last year and a half, it's really heated up. I can't say it a lot without exposing people, but I was on the mail list of suicide, for example. And I'm just wondering what kind of help is out there for people who are fighting the cyber war. They don't even realize how much trouble they're in emotionally, and they're working for large companies. One of the children work for a large manufacturer. Are you observing issues like that out there?
Sure, but it's kind of the same thing again, maybe more, maybe not, I don't know. But in order for a company to fund that, they often have EAP programs and so on, but what's required, as I said, the intelligence community example was a good one, in that their intention is to get the person to work functionally and effectively for the business. And what I'm trying to suggest in the different layers of the talk is that you often need to go even deeper than that in order to look at what is fundamentally broken that keeps generating like a recursive program that you can't get it out of the registry. It's just every time you delete it, it keeps coming back. And if the system is itself flawed and corrupt, then people are going to continue to manifest the symptoms of that system. And the weakest person, just like in a family, when we do family systems therapy, we find that there's always one child. Whoever's got the weak arm can't raise it. The dysfunction in the system is going to manifest through those who are most vulnerable to expressing it. So, and this is not easy. I once worked for a very, very large Fortune 10 company, and a woman came to me in tears because she was a new accountant. She was asked to move millions and millions of dollars, contrary to standard accounting practice. And I told her I would take it up with her boss, because I had a chance to do that in my consulting. And I said to him, there's something I want to ask you. And he just laughed, and he said, are you going to ask me if we cook the books? Of course we cook the books. He said, nobody our size makes quarterly forecasts, more or less, unless they cook the books. Next question. So I went back to her and she said, but my boyfriend, they're telling my boyfriend, your girlfriend sure doesn't understand how businesses work, do they? The pressure was coming in that get with the program or else. So in that case, the or else meant she got with the program, aligned herself with it, found other ways to ameliorate her own cognitive dissonance in order to live with it, rationalized it until the symptoms either got worse and she left or didn't. But in that case, it would be wonderful if communities that are dysfunctional were able to look at themselves in a way that said, like families, nobody's dysfunctional, everybody's functional, but how can we do it a little better? How can we make it less likely for these symptoms to show up? Is there anything we're doing for which we're responsible? And until that happens at the top, bringing in change agents and consultants and all that is just nothing. It's Band-Aid stuff, I think. Okay? You said we're done? All right, I'll be available for more Q&A if you want. Thank you.